Welcome back, Cinephiles. I'm Rod Richards, and today I'm talking about the 1970 film Five Easy Pieces, directed by Bob Rafelson. This is a fascinating film with a ton of great scenes and a ton of difficult situations that many of us can relate to, so let's get into it. One of the major themes in Five Easy Pieces, and the one I find most interesting, is the class divide in America. And though the class division depicted in this film is kind of extreme, it's still basically the same class divide that we have in America today. Our protagonist is named Bobby, or Robert Dupuy, played by Jack Nicholson. And Bobby is a roughneck, an oil rig worker. But he has, you might say, a background that is a little unusual for somebody who does this kind of work. As his background is slowly revealed in the film, we can see that he's a man who has one foot in both worlds. This theme of class division permeates the film to the core, and it plays like two separate films that blend together about as well as oil and water. The first part of the film was shot in or around the town of Taft, California, and Taft is the area around the city of Bakersfield, which sits at the bottom end of California's Central Valley. And for much of the 20th century, this area was associated with agriculture, oil fields, honky-tonk bars, you get the idea. This is where a lot of the refugees from the 1930s Dust Bowl that plagued Oklahoma and surrounding states ended up settling, which is why it was demographically and culturally distinct from other parts of California. In fact, this area spawned its own country music scene in the 1950s, known as the Bakersfield Sound. And country music stars like Buck Owens, whom you may remember if you're old enough, the TV show Hee Haw, and Merle Haggard got their start there. Though much of country music today, to me, is indistinguishable from pop of 20 years ago, if you listen to the country music from, say, 50 years ago or more, you really get a sense of the hardscrabble lives of poverty and brutal, punishing labor that these people led. And that's what the original country music was all about. In the second part of this film, we have the other side of the tracks, so to speak, with the setting changing to Bobby's family home in the Pacific Northwest. And actually it was filmed on Vancouver Island in British Columbia, but it was set in coastal Washington state. And we can assume that this location is a West Coast substitute for New England, which is really where you'd expect a family like Bobby's to be from in real life. The two sides of this class divide are represented by stark contrast between the two main female characters. Karen Black plays Bobby's girlfriend, Rayette. Rayette DePesto. Now, there's a name you won't forget. So Rayette is a waitress in a diner. She's sweet, she's uncomplicated, submissive, guileless, chews with her mouth open, and she's very attractive. On the other hand, we have Catherine, who appears later in the film, played by Susan Anspach. And she is everything that Rayette is not. She's college educated, she's sophisticated, she's obviously from a very different social background than Rayette's. Speaking of Catherine, pay attention in this film how she speaks, her accent and her diction. I don't hear anybody speak that way anymore, but that is the way middle class and up American women spoke back then, at least the women you heard in mainstream media at the time. Another example that springs to my mind would be Catherine Ross in The Graduate. They don't all speak the same way exactly, but their diction has a quality that has pretty much vanished from American life. It's been replaced with this mixture of uptalk and vocal fry that we hear all the time now, and that seemed to sprout up with the millennials, but it probably originated with so-called Valley speak in the late 70s or 80s. Another relationship to pay attention to is Bobby's relationship with his sister, played by Lois Smith, who is really, really good in this role. Their brother and sister relationship is very touching, and she may be the only person in this film whom Bobby doesn't seem to hold in contempt. The cultural and literary historian Paul Fussell, in his book Class, A Guide Through the American Status System, and if you haven't read that, you need to. It's very funny and very insightful, points out that one of the characteristics of blue-collar or working-class life is its relative lack of pretense, and that fraud and misrepresentation are a defining characteristic of the middle and upper classes. If you want to observe this phenomenon for yourself, go sit at a bar that caters to a mainly blue-collar clientele and strike up conversations with some people. And make a mental note of how often the people you meet seem to be trying to impress you in some way. Then do the same thing at a more middle class or bougie establishment. You'll notice a definite inauthenticity in some people who seem to be desperately trying to maintain their status. They're always trying to appear more important than they are. They're always policing their grammar and their speech. In short, they're constantly performing on some level. And once you start noticing this behavior in certain people, you can't unsee it. And this is what I imagine happened to our protagonist Bobby in Five Easy Pieces. He may not feel at home in the world that he inhabits, but when he's reunited with his family after a long absence, he gets a stark reminder of why he left in the first place. The director of Five Easy Pieces, Bob Rafelson, was associated with the so-called New Hollywood movement, and this was a time where a certain group of new directors started to have a lot more control over the films they made than was previously the norm in Hollywood. Five Easy Pieces is one of the earliest films to have what I would call a more modern 70s feel. American cinema definitely started to pick up a murkier quality around this time that was very noticeable compared to what was common in the 1960s and before. This was a time where even mainstream films began to veer away from typical audience expectations and often didn't wrap up endings very neatly, for example. And you start to see characters in these movies who have very complicated relationships with other people and whose motivations are not always clear. This sort of realism was definitely less common in Hollywood before about the late 1960s. If we think of the 60s as a fun-filled night of drinking in a bar, then the New Hollywood movement is like the manager turning on all the lights because it's closing time. To illustrate just how quickly the culture was changing back then, watch a typical beach party movie with Frankie Avalon and Annette Funicello from the 1960s, the mid-1960s, and then watch Five Easy Pieces. Now granted, these are two very different kinds of films, but it is still astonishing that Hollywood was cranking out this innocent beach party stuff just 5 years before movies like Five Easy Pieces. These two films look like they were made 20 years apart in completely different cultures. Okay, that's all I'm going to say about Five Easy Pieces. You definitely need to watch this movie or rewatch it if it's been a while. Let me know what you think in the comments. Thank you for watching. See you next time.